Tonight we'll adjust the dial to a different frequency. We've invited another Lucas, not Lucas Foley, will be with us next week, but it's our run of Lucases, and that is Lucas Blalock. I don't know if anyone saw Lucas's ever so brief, I know one person here did, see Lucas's very brief exhibition at Ramekin Crucible, a small little Lower East Side gallery that was up for just a brief 10 or 15 days. Go figure. Really interesting installation. And I don't know if you've had a chance to see any of three of Lucas's publications, but I believe if you have seen them, or if you do look, you'll agree with me that his work challenges the very conventions of photography, of studio practice, in not only imaginative but hugely inventive ways, open to chance, using the studio as a laboratory, collapsing both production and post-production into one seamless experiment. Lucas makes pictures that disrupt the portrait and the still life genre. Imagined realities are created rather than depicting documentary fact in traditional fashion. It's incredibly smart, dynamic work. I think back many years ago when Marvin Heiferman and I did a series of young artists back in the 80s, people like Richard Prince, Nan Golden, Laurie Simon, Lorna Simpson, others. I think of Lucas's work in that same genre, very alive, very vital, very questioning about the ways that photography gives meaning and the ways that photography is malleable in the hands of someone that's thoughtful and attentive. Without further ado, I need not build his ego anymore. Join me in welcoming Lucas Blalock to ICP. Lucas.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Phil, for the introduction. How do we get this thing up? Okay, cool. So I want to begin with this picture, and this is a picture for Mark from 2012. And I think it would be odd to ask what happened to a painting. A painting is a picture that's made by piling up decisions on a plane. So nothing really happens to a painting except its own making. But photography is different. If you interrupt the naturalism that we expect in photography, we sort of immediately set to correct the issues in our mind. If you clone stamp all of the objects out of a still life photograph using Photoshop, are these objects still in the picture? Have they been removed or covered up? Is this process additive or subtractive? Are these pictures now more full of objects because of this covering? Or else are the pictures, are they pictures with a past that was sort of once full of things? And is this picture still a photograph? If this action had been done seamlessly, would it be more of a photograph? And if so, what sense does that make? What does it sort of say about photography? And these are the kinds of questions that have been really sort of active in my practice for the last number of years. And I want to start by claiming to be a photographer and to making photographs. And for me, this has meant a lot more than just using a camera to make my pictures. I say it more in the way a painter might claim painting, as a continuation of a historical activity. I'm interested in claiming photography because in my work, I have an investment in its messy histories and its ontological problems. Photography as a field has given me a way to think about innovating within it, but also an opportunity to think about how its varied historical conditions and concerns might be alive today. For me, being an artist is about the double activity of carrying the past forward and of responding to the conditions of the present. I see photography as a shared construction, a plastic set of conventions that support our using it. You could think about a language this way, as something that we sort of make as we go, that it's really sort of a shared convention instead of a thing you can know objectively. And I also want to say in the next hour that I'll talk a lot about picture making, which in different modes is how I've seen my work since the beginning. I don't see this as a marginal or hermetic activity, nor really as an expression, but as a way to make something that refracts the conditions of its making without closing down a view of the conditions of the world seen through it. You could say that once my work moved into the studio, I will also be telling the story of sort of complicating that condition. And I'll also talk about models that have worked in the background of my practice, and want to say now that not much has ever been discarded. It's been more of an accumulation, a buildup where certain problems come to the front for some period of time. And again, all this sounds all sort of very serious, but for me, the activity of doing it has often been really full of jokes and play. So I want to start back from the beginning. So I grew up interested in writing and film, and I went to college thinking that that's what I would do. I went to Bard in upstate New York, and while I was there, I sort of ended up in a cultural situation that also included art, which was something that I hadn't really had much exposure to previously. And in my second year at Bard, I took a course called Literature and Photography, and we read Susan Sontag and Roland Barts and James Agee and all these other texts that are sort of seminal to the history of photography. And I think that reading these books before I started making pictures really sort of informed how I approached making photographs when I did. And of course, I was also really into movies and novels. This is a still from Blue Velvet, the David Lynch movie. And David Lynch was really important to me. Alfred Hitchcock was really important to me. But so were the sort of counterculture of the 1960s and the Beat Generation. And so early on, I was interested in artists like Cindy Sherman, but I was also interested in people like Robert Frank. So this is one of my pictures from that time. This is a self-portrait as me, as Janet Leigh from the Psycho shower scene. And this is from 2000. So as you might can tell, photography for me early on was essentially just really short movie making. And at the time, the sense was really pervasive in a lot of work, which I think is probably why I initially felt such an easy home making pictures. And it's also worth noting that the contentious question at the time wasn't sort of yet about whether a picture had been manipulated, but at the time it was more about whether a picture had been staged or not. And I think I came into photography sort of thinking about all the creative activity of photography going on sort of beyond the lens, like either in a kind of organizational way or else in sort of the staging of a fiction. And so there are two sort of really foundational early influences for me. This is a photograph by Stephen Shore, who was at Bard and was my senior project advisor there. And this is a photograph by Jeff Wall, who came and spoke at Bard while I was there, but whose work had a huge presence at the time in the late 90s. And I think his writing also really contributed to the way that I ended up thinking about photographs. And I think one thing worth sort of saying about these two that has really influenced the way I've continued to move on is that both of them really put a lot of importance on photography as picture making. And I mean to sort of, take some distance from reportage. So it's like, Stephen was doing this in a very organizational way. He was sort of hyper-organizing the world into a picture. And Jeff also had a kind of structural component, but it was also this idea of staging of fictions. And so these two influences really, I think, set the stage for pretty much everything that was to come for me. And having them also set up a sort of secondary problem, or I don't know, it's a secondary situation that I've been navigating ever since, which is that there's sort of two parallel histories that get presented through these two projects. And through Stephen, I think I was really sort of picking up art photography, which, the sort of canonical tradition through Atche and Walker Evans and MoMA. And through Jeff Wall, I was also sort of picking up influences through things like conceptualism and filmmaking and other kinds of projects. So I sort of looked for my own voice in this way for a number of years. Like I was sort of thinking out of this sort of cinematic space, this kind of decision making. And by 2006, I really was sort of at loose ends a little bit. Like I was starting to make sculpture some. I was thinking about maybe going into architecture. I don't know, photography really didn't necessarily feel like what I wanted to do. And I just didn't feel like I was making a tremendous amount of headway. And then a really unexpected way forward sort of emerged. So I would like to lay out 3 influences that really moved my work in a new direction. And in time sort of have become the undergirding for where I'm at now. And the first one is that early in 2007, I read Moby Dick. And this book had a really profound effect on me. And I love the book, and my enthusiasm about it got me talking about it. And I was living with an old friend at the time who was just finishing his PhD in British history. And we started talking a lot about the second half of the 19th century and how many of the models that were put in place then became the skeleton for our experience of the modern world. And among these models were, or among these shifts at that moment were the Industrial Revolution, the introduction of the modern idea of the self through Marx and Freud, the birth of the metropolis, the reframing of time through the railroad, and the invention of new technologies, including photography. And he recommended some books, and I found others, and I ended up becoming really ensconced in sort of Victorian America, which is sort of the last place just a few years earlier I would have ever thought to go looking for renewal of energy. But in the end, it was an age of tremendous innovation and tremendously high anxiety about all this stuff that was changing. And I think seeing photography in this light is a building block of the societies that came after 1839, and getting a window into relating to that experience through Melville gave me a really new context to think about what I was doing. And all of this felt particularly pertinent in 2007 and 2008, at a time when the anxiety about digital culture was really high. And some of the reframings around speed and subjecthood that this history spoke to had strong contemporary parallels. So if Moby Dick was the first third, getting into Goddard's films was the second. I'd liked his movies since seeing one at the end of high school, but it wasn't until this point that I really got involved with them. And they were really a revelation to me because it was immediately evident that, at least in the early ones, that they were made on this kind of intimate scale, that, just sort of with very few people and sort of off the cuff. And also that they were sort of structured by borrowing a conventional plot and then interrupting its rhythms. And I think Goddard did this very famously with the jump cut, but he also had a way of doing it through sort of through asides and through gags. And it reminded me of jazz, or like the jazz standard, where a song we all know, or there's sort of a counting on us all knowing a song, so that can then hold an armature for another kind of play. And so my work through these 2 influences started to develop by looking widely at the history of photography and thinking about some of the ideas or effects that these pictures I was finding in books might be rethought or remade. I was just sort of mining. I was looking for pictures I was interested in, and then sort of looking for places that they might have a kind of contemporary other. And photography itself started to feel like an archive of decisions that could be plumbed. And I think that this is the way a writer might think about literature or a painter painting. And I was first interested in putting pictures against each other in combinations, which I feel like was sort of, a real first step for me. And this is and the next 2 after it are spreads from my first book, which I self-published, called I Believe You Liar, from 2009. And so my work, so I also discovered that there were some other contemporary artists who were sort of also felt to be mining the history of photography. And the 2 who made the most impact on me were Roe Etheridge and Christopher Williams, who in their own ways were sort of borrowing modalities from the past and sort of bringing them forward. But I really was just looking back a lot, and I'm going to show a few of the pictures that I was sort of seeing and then a few of the pictures that I was making. This is a multigraph, which was a popular carte de visite in the 19th century. This is a picture by Atge. This is a picture by Manray. Sorry about the caption. This is Paul Outerbridge. And he and Steichen were in a really weird, had a contest between each other to make pictures of eggs, and supposedly both of them made over 1,000 pictures of eggs. This is Edward Steichen. This is Brancusi, who made a lot of photographs. Manray taught him to use the camera, and he made a lot of photographs in his own studio. And so these are some of the pictures I was making. So while I was making this work, I was thinking a lot about how to make something strange, or how to get it to act up. Like what I was saying about Goddard, I was working through these conventions from the history of photo, but at the same time was wanting these pictures to feel sort of off or my own. And I also sort of wasn't finding myself in a world full of the really nice, well-made objects that I was seeing in old photographs. And so the world I was in was actually sort of full of a lot of cheap plastic things. And so I was ended up making a still life practice out of sort of learning these classical compositional strategies that I was looking at in old pictures. But I was doing it with these very inexpensive objects. And there was a strangeness available in lavishing this kind of attention on things that were never intended to be looked at so carefully. And I sort of followed this feeling in the work. I started thinking about how photography cuts the world into parts or units, and how this encourages our desire to name, which relates to the camera's sort of taxonomic properties. I started thinking about how a picture might undermine this naming without actually suppressing the activity. This would result in something that I ended up thinking about as sort of hedging or babbling or stuttering. And so this work sort of came to a close with this book, which is Towards a Warm Math, which was published by Hassler Books in 2011. And it's, I don't know, it's funny, when I was making it, it didn't feel like a love letter to the history of photography, but a few years removed from it, it really does. And so sort of alongside naming, another way I was sort of thinking about these units was through math. Because when I'd been thinking about photography in a more cinematic way when I was a little younger, I was really thinking about narrativity all the time. And photographs seemed to be really particularly bad at carrying narrative. And so by this point, I was really interested in trying to think of another model that where I could string a group of works together and not sort of claim narrative. And math sort of became that thing. And it's called warm math because photography, unlike math, which is a truly abstract language, it really doesn't need the world to be itself. Photography is really best, especially to me, and it's sort of a relational capacity. And so the warmth in the warm math is its need for the world, its need to relate to things and sort of, have the world to make chunks of. And so around this same time, this picture was made sort of at the same time as the pictures in Towards a Warm Math. But it was sort of maybe the beginning of another sort of trajectory in my work. And if I said that Moby Dick was sort of a first third and Goddard was a second third, the sort of third of that is Bertolt Brecht. And Brecht is someone I found through Goddard, but he's not. But he really ended up sort of taking up his own place in my work. And from Brecht, Brecht has this idea of the epic theater, which is a theater that was a critique of the sort of classical theater space, where the audience is in a very passive, removed from the stage, and the action of the stage is sort of hermetically sealed within its interior. And Brecht had this idea that you could make theater sort of a theater for the modern man that had a kind of social component by breaking down these sort of strict divisions. And so in Brecht's theater, you were sort of supposed to see the labor of the production of the play, of the theater itself. And so, you not only saw the character acted, but you also saw the actor acting. You not only saw sort of the world of the sets, but you also saw the sets themselves, and that this sort of double register was something that he thought would keep the audience from leaving their sort of social selves at home. And I think at the time I was working in the studio a lot, which was a very theatrical situation. I mean, I had lights and there was a kind of little stage, and I was sort of setting objects up on this stage. And so I think Brecht felt particularly available. And I started thinking about how much sort of backstage photography hid, you know, that there was all this stuff that was being sort of tucked to the side, and, you know, really sort of that we were pretending wasn't there. And so I sort of felt like if you could make a photograph in that way, that you could also make photographs in a way that sort of brought this material back into the picture. And another thing that sort of happened at the same, or maybe through Brecht, is that I really, up until this point, had really thought about digital as being basically like a replacement darkroom. You know, I was using it in a way that I didn't have access to a darkroom all the time, so I bought a scanner and was using Photoshop, but I really wasn't thinking about it as a tool in its own. And I think that reading Brecht really got me to think about what tools I was using and what the possibilities of those tools were. And Photoshop became, and has remained, a pretty large part of my work. But I think before I go on from this, I want to say that you know, a lot of people use Brecht in a really didactic way, that it's sort of seen as, it's very much from the Marxist tradition, and it's often sort of used in a way to make things textual, not really to make pictures. And I think I really ended up using it in something that was more like the overproduction that goes on in like a burlesque or a slapstick. You know, that I really wanted to leave room in this construction to keep up with picture making. So this is what you get if you Google digital age. So these three influences I just described are one way to get to this sort of place in my work by 2009. But I think it's sort of important to talk about some of the other things that were going on. And somewhere between 2006 and 2009, I think that the sort of digital paradigm caught up to photography more generally. And being involved in art photography, you know, at the time, one of the major sort of shifts that happened was that all of a sudden you really had to choose to make a picture on paper. You know, like before that, there was really no way to make a dematerialized photograph. And all of a sudden, to make a photograph material was a choice. And it had a lot of implications. This is a piece by Walid Beshti called Picture Made by My Hand with the Assistance of Light. And so on one side, there was a lot of practice that sort of doubled down on this and sort of went headlong into this anxiety. And there were a lot of sort of abstract and process-based works that came out around this time. But these things, I think it might be sort of useful to think about them as sort of photographs as objects. But, you know, I think what was sort of, in some way, that them going toward being essentially photographic sort of left out some of the things that I was most excited about in picture making, which was the sort of picture making part of it. But I think I do want to say that it did have the effect of really sort of shifting the conversation of photography from one about picture making to one about object making, and that is really remained a tension in where we are now. But then there was also this really underdetermined object, which was sort of the Google image object, and it sort of lacked materiality altogether. And it was really less important in its role as a picture than it was in its roles of exchange or elasticity or textuality. And in my own work, I was really interested in elements of both ends of the spectrum. I was interested in the odd combinations, the borderlessness, the malleability, and the possibility of versions in the image. But I was also still invested in making a picture, a thing of specific qualities that hung on the wall and addressed the viewer. And having contended with abstraction and concrete photography, and having to now make this sort of choice to make a print, to materialize the picture, the basic model of my work shifted, I think, pretty hard from a cinematic one to one that was not only based on Brecht, but also in painting. And I think that painting was sort of an easy taker because it had really gone through a similar crisis of objecthood about 100 years before. So again, sort of, as I came up on something new, I sort of started metabolizing a lot of art history. So this is a painting by Cezanne, and I'm just going to show a handful of paintings that were sort of particularly, or paintings by painters who were particularly important to me. And, I think when I sort of stepped out of just thinking primarily through photography and its canon, I was making still life studio pictures, and Cezanne is sort of the first master to turn to, I guess. And his pictures were really interesting to me, and learning to really understand them and like them was really interesting to me. But it also ended up sort of opening up the history of modern painting in a way that, he's sort of a cornerstone. So there was a way to sort of go out from him and discover a lot of other things. This is a painting by John Wesley, who's a 1960s sort of American pop artist, who's still alive and making work. But I don't know, I just loved, he's got a real sort of penchant for strangeness, and his pictures sort of meant a lot. This is Polka. Polka I sort of was into for myriad reasons, and he makes such heterogeneous work. But one of the things I was really interested in was that he, was really, often used very discrete layers. And this is something that felt sort of available to the way I was making pictures in Photoshop. And he also, I really sort of loved the way that he was really willing to stretch painting sort of pell-mell and make, really just take it to places that it sort of probably was never intended to go. This is a painting by Magritte from this sort of amazing series of paintings that he made in 1947 called Period Vache. And he had been, before, in the 20s, at sort of the height of surrealism, had been sort of passed over by a really influential French gallery that was showing a lot of surrealist work. And so after the Second World War, he was invited to do a show there, and he responded by self-describedly trying to make the worst paintings he could possibly figure out how to make. And so there's like 40 or 50 of these things, and they're sort of incredible. But I love that is an impulse, as a way to make a group of things. And this is Philip Guston, who's somebody who I'll sort of come back and talk about some more later. But I should also mention Amy Silliman and Charlene von Heil and Albert Uhlin and Klaus Oldenburg and Bonnard, and really the list goes on and on. But I think I really borrowed a lot of just sort of pictorial intelligence from painting. But maybe the most significant thing I got from painting was learning sort of to use the medium and its conditions as things to think against. And I started to think of photography as a tennis partner, as an opponent. And I also started making pictures all the time, like someone might paint. But this is something I really related more to being a kid and sort of learning to play a sport or play the piano. And that this kind of like, daily activity where you just sort of put some hours in, show up and do it, was something that really changed the quality of my work. And I think the best way to sort of talk about this period of time for me is this book, which is called Windows, Mirrors, Tabletops, which is basically a studio notebook of 18 months of work. And it starts in May of 2011 and goes until the 1st of 2013. And it's really like a studio notebook. It's got finished pieces, but it's also sort of got in-between works. And I made it during a period where I had gone to Skowhegan in the summer of 2011 and then had gone straight to graduate school at UCLA just after. And so when I was putting it together in March of 2013, it was just, the newest pictures were just a few months old. And I was sort of just cataloging this period of time. But it's 175 pictures, so we're going to see it really fast. Everything, basically, sort of the rule in my work right now has been that everything gets made with the tools that you would make any picture with. You know, so I'm using the tools in Photoshop that one might use to make a straight photograph. So there's really never any material work. All right. So around the time I was making this book, I started describing the tool I was using to make my pictures as an assisted camera. And the assisted camera is a description of an apparatus that contains both the camera, which in my case is a 4x5, as well as the computer's processing capacities. And I believe that in the contemporary moment, when we refer to a photograph, we're referring to a picture made with this apparatus. And you can replace 4x5 and Photoshop with iPhone and Instagram. But what I want to get at is that there's sort of a bond at this point between the capturing device and the general use of a technology to adjust that capture. And it's not at all that you can't make an unmanipulated picture, but that where just a short time ago we understood a photograph to be an impression on film with definite boundaries, in our digital culture we see photographs as permeated by malleability. And this, I think, is a really different social construction than was sort of going on in 2006 when I started using digital some, or in 2009. So it seems like a sort of constantly moving sort of social situation. So I want to introduce a few other ideas that have been active in my work lately. Since Windows Mirror's Tabletops, the model of Brecht's theater that I've been using to understand and communicate my work has begun to be replaced by a different set of metaphors that center around drawing and touch. And these metaphors are not mutually exclusive, but where theater is about presenting, which requires distance, drawing for me is about bringing closer. But before I get there, I want to acknowledge that what I want to talk about seems to have grown pretty directly out of the fact that I've been working so long and so often in the studio. And to acknowledge that this situation is shared by a lot of young photographers. And I sort of went to the studio originally for really personal reasons. I was working a full-time job here in New York. I was living here. I didn't have a car. I was making pictures with a big camera. I wanted to be making a lot of work, and the studio was one of the few conditions I could sort of figure out to make that happen. But I've also thought about why so much photography is being made this way. And one idea is that the studio works as a kind of second camera selecting device, and that this affords authorship and sort of easily constructs the conditions for experiment. And this might be particularly interesting in a time of sort of changing modalities, when the grammar of the picture-making tool itself is sort of a little up in the air. And Jeff Wall says something like this when he's writing about early modernist painting, which were sort of another group of picture makers who were at a moment of sort of huge technological change. And he writes about how the attraction of these avant-garde practitioners to lower genre pictures, like the still life or the studio portrait, was could be sort of understood as them moving toward the freest space. That these were sort of the less important genres, and so they weren't being sort of policed as heavily as the others. And so because of that, there was sort of extra room open for innovation. And further than that, he talks about how these kinds of pictures are sort of, maybe because of this sort of double bracketing that the studio does, are particularly good at sort of making a picture that's sort of able to be seen as a picture. And these are, and this, excuse me. So relating to this, I want to talk about how space has developed in my pictures of late, which has really grown directly out of thinking through this model. So there's that picture. So there's this space in my work that I borrowed, I think, predominantly from advertising photography, which I will call a shelf space. And I mean by this a space that begins at the backdrop or back wall and then builds forward like the space of a stage. And this could be opposed to the flat space of the picture plane or the sort of deep space of landscape pictures. And particularly when using the vertical format, this shelf construction has really allowed my computer interventions to take place sort of in the sculptural space of the photograph as well as on its surface. And it gives the sense that these things are happening to the object pictured, whereas in a deep space picture, these same kinds of interventions end up really just sitting on the surface and not really seeming to affect the objects in the picture. And so again, I feel like between the sort of the super flatness of the picture plane and the sort of deep space, I'm again sort of finding a kind of middle ground. And this one you guys just saw, but these are a few pictures that have been made in this kind of deep space, or excuse me, this kind of shelf space situation. So this way of building photographs in the studio in this short space from the back forward has a sort of spatial harmony or a parallelism with the way that Photoshop is designed. And which is, it's designed as sort of layers that sort of sit in front of a background. And I became really explicitly interested in sort of conflating these two registers. And in works like this one, which is titled Gobbo with Fans from 2012, I'm sort of obviously playing with the language of collage, but I sort of really remained interested in how it was that these things sort of could stay photographs, or I could make an argument for them as photographs. But starting with this picture, which is called 5 Positions, which is also 2012, I got interested in breaking down some of the formulas I'd been working with, so sort of breaking down this shelf space, to see if I could make pictures that would transform this space into a more complicated planar space, but one where the objects would still sort of retain their tactility. And the shelf had provided a really useful space where I could make these sort of sculptural interventions in the computer that took place within and not on top of the container of the picture. But in this structure, the viewer had a distance to look across, like in the theater. And even if I sort of unsealed this distance or let the sort of offstage bleed in, there was still, it was setting up a structure that was sort of parallel. It was really, the space of the pictures was very distinct from the space of your body. And I think from that sort of, I guess, developed into a kind of problem that I could think about. And I got interested in a more planar space because I was looking for a way to bring the body into a more immediate relationship with the world of the picture and to collapse that bodily space of the image forward while trying to retain its picturedness. And this is where Guston comes back. And Philip Guston's late paintings became the primary model for this. And I think he was doubly interesting to me because I was also at the time interested in trying to make pictures bigger, like specifically pictures of small things larger. And Guston had this sort of, often this sort of unreal planar space. It's not deep space, but it's not, this kind of shallow shelf. And he was also had this incredible way of making these very small things very large without them sort of losing their tactility. Like they didn't sort of turn into flat signs. And so he's somebody who I really am continuing to think through. But I was also looking at other people. This is État donné, which is Duchamp's late work, which implicates the body in a whole lot of different ways. This is a photograph by Cindy Sherman. This is a picture by Anthony Hernandez from a project called Landscapes for the Homeless. And I could also talk about, I didn't put a slide in, but I could also talk about Lee Friedlander in this way. And these are sort of some of the recent pictures that I've been making, sort of thinking about this planar space. All right, so continuing pretty directly out of this idea of collapse for me has been rethinking the camera as a drawing machine. And in this construction, I've been thinking about the photographic act not as one of indexical, impersonal capture, but instead of one as drawing, a method by which humans for millennia have tried to relate to, understand, and possess a world otherwise beyond their influence. And drawing is a way to do that via the sympathetic magic of describing or copying pictorially. And if we think about the photograph as a bad copy instead of a good one, as an act of partial articulation instead of the final word, with the onus on how capable that copy is to sort of relay meaning or sympathy and not merely likeness, then the medium opens onto new questions. And drawing is arguably the activity that the invention of photography is sort of most displaced. And I don't think it's at all a new idea to sort of talk about photography through drawing. But for me, this drawing has taken on a kind of double register. First, in the drawing of relationships to the object pictured, sort of beyond the narrow confines of its role as a commodity. And secondly, in drawing contemporary photographic space, which includes digital space. And I mean this sort of newly malleable space, this surface, this space that's sort of behind the surface of the screen or behind the surface of the photograph. And further, I've been working on drawing this dematerialized or disembodied space into relationship with my own embodied self. And the screen sets up a really cerebral engagement. It's, in a way, we're sort of bodiless when we look at screens. And I'm really interested in whether that space sort of behind the screen if I can find a way to sort of address it nervously. And thinking about touch and drawing and the implications of bringing that space of the pictures, both worldly and virtual, into the sort of a direct relationship to my sort of haptic or sensual experience is really sort of where I am in the work right now. And I'm going to show some more pictures. This one's called Shoe. And all these pictures have titles. I haven't been giving any of them. This one's called Two Lettuces. All right, so I've recently been working on a conversation with the Norwegian photographer Morten Andenas. And in our conversation, Morten brought up this thing that Robbe-Grillet had said in his book, Why I Love Roland Barthes. And in it, he talks about, Robbe-Grillet says that he has memorized entire passages, like almost entire books by Roland Barthes. And he's done this because he wants to know the text through speaking it. And so he says he has a habit of taking running himself a bath and sitting in the bath and speaking whole volumes of Bart's writing. And that this is this sort of tremendous way to get to know a text, you know. And he talks about it as it's speaking the words as if they were his own thoughts, that this is the sort of relationship he's looking for. But in a sort of more comical way, he also calls it taking Bart's text in his mouth. And I really loved this idea of sort of a bodily knowing a text through speaking. And I immediately wanted to think about pictures this way. And I'm really curious about a pictorial analog to this, a sort of visual knowing through bodily imagination. To me, learning contemporary photographic space through the body, which is cumbersome and antithetical to sort of the pure disembodied exchange of the image, but still pictorial, has implications that go beyond aesthetics and have bearing on how we use these tools to sort of create new imaginary spaces. And this rescaling of the photographic picture to the body as opposed to insisting on the eye has really been a very intriguing way for me to think about going forward with my work from here. And so before I go, I just want to share a little bit about this book that I will be signing copies of after the talk. It's a new book. It was published by Paradigm. It's a publisher here in New York, and it's called Inside the White Cub, and it's basically a counterfeit version of an exhibition catalog that was supposed to be published when I did a project with White Cube in 2012, but the series was canceled just before our exhibitions, and the book never came to be. And so, but we'd already sort of gathered all the materials, so we saw an opportunity to basically make an ersatz version of this book. And it comes packaged with a 2020 wall calendar. And it's, yeah, I don't know, I'm really excited about it. It also is the first book that really shows, that sort of looks at my work is in terms of exhibitions instead of just being sort of a very straightforward artist book. So thank you very much.